Hey everyone, welcome to Unit 2, Substance Use Across the Lifespan. This is week 2 online. Our agenda for our online this week is that we are going to define what a process addiction is, and then we will compare and contrast that with substance addictions, which we spent time on in class. And then I'm just going to introduce the topics of substance use from youth to older adults. There are some activities in here that I encourage you pause the video and complete on your own. It'll solidify the learning better if you do it that way than if you just listen to me and listen to my answers. But of course, the choice, as always, is up to you. All right, so beginning with talking about process addictions, I've included the link here to the problem gambling, which describes and defines process addictions in detail. So again, this is one of those scenarios where I would encourage that if you have not already read this document, then please pause the video, read the document, and then return to this video PowerPoint. Just to give you a brief overview, this is the document that I'm referring to. So you can see it clearly defines what a process addiction is. It proceeds to talk about factors that make process addictions more likely. And it spends time really describing the details and doing the compare and contrast between process addictions and substance addictions. So again, I really encourage you to read online. If you don't want to read the entire thing, then I would at the very least encourage you read the definition of what a process addiction is. All right, back to me. Here we go. All right, so we want to compare and contrast. So here is where you would stop and think about the similarities between process addictions and substance addiction. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the differences. So according to that article, there are similarities such as dysfunctional behavior and being habit forming. Also, we have cognitive distortions and deficits in decision making. So with either type of addiction, whether it's process or substance related, we can have these cognitive distortions, which are also known as thinking errors. This is a fun activity if you want to take some time to do. Google thinking errors and see what you come up with. You'll find a whole wealth of research that talks about how people will set up sort of catastrophic thinking or mind reading or trying to predict the future, which are these cognitive distortions that can contribute to the triggers of process and substance use addictions. Both types of addictions also have rituals that trigger arousal. And again, when we get into that sympathetic nervous system, that state of arousal, then human nature is to seek something that might lower that state of arousal, and both substances can do that as well as process addictions. They kind of become this maladaptive coping mechanism. Both types of addictions, unfortunately, are low in treatment success rates. I was actually apprehensive to include this fact, but it is written in the article that I've posted for you to read, so I wanted to be transparent about it. I just didn't want it to be discouraging for you or for your clients. This is one of those facts that you would keep to yourself and definitely not share with a client, because obviously it wouldn't give them much optimism in working on whatever their addictions issues are. But it's important for you to be mindful that relapse is unfortunately common, and so that's something we want to work with when we're doing our motivational interviewing. Both process and substance addictions also have a decline in enjoyment over time. So we've talked a little bit about substance use and chasing that first high. Well, the same can kind of be said for process addictions. In the end, it becomes more of this sort of habit forming, just a thing that they do to relieve the tension or anxiety or discomfort they're feeling, but they actually are not getting as much enjoyment in the activity as they might have originally. And then lastly, both types can have a perceived loss of control. This last piece here, I hope really helps with your empathy when working with these clients, because it's not as easy for them to just stop doing what they're doing despite the consequences that are resulting from what they're doing. Many clients that I've worked with are very painstakingly aware of the consequences of either their substance use or process addiction, and yet they continue to engage in these activities. So again, you need to remember that there is this perceived loss of control, and we want to connect them back with an internal locus of control. Okay, getting on to some differences. So substance addiction inevitably is ingesting a substance, whereas a process addiction encompasses behavior. And then the other big difference is that we cannot actually equate tolerance or withdrawal to process addictions the same as with substance addictions. We need a little bit more research in that area. So we cannot equate tolerance and withdrawal in terms of the physiological mechanisms. All right, comparing substance and process addictions, most experts recognize 5 process addictions. So they are sexual addiction, gambling addiction, work addiction, compulsive buying, and food and disordered eating. Those are the 5. So what I want you to do, and here's again where you would pause the video and go and take some time to reflect on this and then return to the video. So consider one of the 5. Anyone that you might be interested in or that you might think you'd encounter a client with, anyone. So either sexual addiction, gambling addiction, work addiction, compulsive buying, or food and disordered eating. So choose one of the 5 and answer the questions on the following slide. Is there a particular group or population who is more at risk to develop your process addiction, whichever one you've chosen? What are some similarities between a process addiction and a substance addiction? What are some differences between a process addiction and a substance addiction? And again, I encourage that you're referring to the link and article that we posted as you're answering those questions. So pause, take a moment, answer these questions, and then come back to the video. Here are the answers. So the first question was if there's a particular group or population who's more at risk for process addictions. And the answer is that specific process addictions tend to be more gender and age specific. For example, youth, the elderly, as well as competitive athletes may be more at risk of developing a gambling problem, whereas females tend to be more at risk of developing compulsive shopping and disordered eating. Surprised by that? What are some of the similarities from your process addiction of the 5 that you chose and a substance addiction? So we kind of already defined this, but both process and substance addictions can have significant negative consequences to one's physical and emotional health, as well as to relationships and finances. Again, think of the bio, psycho, social, spiritual impact. As well, psychological factors likely both play a role in both types of addictions in terms of triggers and leading up to. And then the last question is, what are some differences between your process addiction and a substance addiction? Again, we talked about this. As stated in the slides, process addictions involve behavior, whereas substance addiction involve ingesting a substance. Okay, so we're moving into the second half of our online this week, which is really getting into the substance use across the lifespan. So we won't reflect on substance and process in terms of across the lifespan, but now that we know the similarities and differences, you can relate either substance or process and compare it to across the lifespan as we proceed. So let's find the facts. We want to think about youth versus older adults, the fact that it's going to be unique individual characteristics that we're looking at. However, what we're doing here is we're looking at some of the trends, because the trends and similarities among those 2 sets of populations will help us to develop treatment approaches to each individual. So even though there might be unique characteristics, we still need the trends in order to develop kind of system-wide approaches. There are going to be differences in common triggers and the impact biopsychosocially on these 2 groups of populations. And we want to uncover the facts by selecting the population that interests you most. So we're going to talk today about youth, and we're going to talk about older adults. You can also look at both, and then I think you're a keener, which is awesome. All right, so the youth activity. What you first have to do is, again, pause the video, click on this link, locate the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey, as is in this link, and I want you to answer the questions on the following slide. So click on the link. Here are the questions. How do rates of tobacco and alcohol use based on the survey, in 2015 survey compare to rates in the mid-1980s? Describe changes in rates of cannabis use that have occurred over the 90s, 2000s, and now, and how do rates of drug use compare across the various regions throughout Ontario? So take a moment, pause the video, find the answers to the questions, jot them down, and then come back. Personal reflection questions are, how do you feel about the number of students that have tried alcohol and cannabis, And what are your thoughts on social media and addiction? When you're ready, here are the answers. So in terms of rates of tobacco and alcohol use across those years, the answer is that current rates of tobacco and alcohol use among Ontario students are significantly less, woohoo, celebration, than they were in the 1980s, and are the lowest in the 35-plus year history of the survey. So that's definitely a celebratory point, one that we want to draw on the strengths of and maybe apply to other types of substances. The second question was describing the changes in the rates of cannabis use. And the answer to that is that overall rates of cannabis have also declined since the early 2000s until now. Rates of cannabis peaked in the 1970s, declined significantly in the mid to late 1980s, before spiking again in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. But the current rates suggest that roughly 21% of students surveyed report having used cannabis during the previous year. And then lastly, how do rates of drug use compare across the various regions in Ontario? The answer to that is that overall rates of alcohol and drug use do not appear to significantly differ across provinces. Surprised by that? Although there is more use in urban and rural areas where we see increases in the use of specific drugs. So there might be some variation in terms of urban and rural. And then these are the personal questions which you will discuss with your peers online on DC Connect. Those of you who selected older adults as your population of interest, again, you're going to click on these two links. So there's two of them there. Open those links and then we can answer the following questions and then come back to the video. So the questions for those of you in the older adult interest is, what is the prevalence of mental health issues in older adults? You'll find that in the CMHA link. The second question is, what are the 4 core elements of the senior framework in the CMHA link? And then lastly, what are 2 reasons that substance use in older adults may be overlooked? And that's in the BC link. And then your personal reflection questions, which you'll answer on DC Connect, is what are your thoughts, feelings, or reactions to the information about high use of prescriptions and risk of alcohol abuse unnoticed in this population? And what are your ideas about accessing and assertively reaching out to older adults who might be at risk of substance use? Are we doing a good job with this in our society, and where can we make improvements? So pause the video, take time to answer those first 3 questions, and then come on back. All right, answers to your questions. Look at that, I have them already up there for you. So in terms of the prevalence of mental health in older adults, the answer to that is 17 to 30% of older adults. And then what are the 4 core elements of a senior framework as focused by CMHA? One is that it's community-based care. The second is that it's collaborative efforts across all sectors to deliver a social model of care. So that's rooted in knowing that humans are social beings by nature, and that sort of model is probably going to be a best practice when providing treatment. And then recovery-based approach should involve the family and caregivers. And lastly, the same sort of theme, that client and family involvement in system planning, implementation, and evaluation is necessary. So we don't want to look just at the individual and then throw them back into the environment that might have been triggering for all their mental health and or addictions concerns. We want to involve the entire family and caregivers to help educate them in the treatment of the individual. And then lastly, what are 2 reasons that substance use in older adults may be overlooked? This was in the BC link. One is that older adults are more likely to drink or use drugs at home rather than in public. Older adults may not have duties that are affected by substance use, such as work or going to school. That kind of makes sense. And then signs of substance use are similar to those found in health problems that many older adults have, such as depression and dementia. So again, it can be overlooked, unfortunately. And lastly, caregivers of older adults may be aware of the problem, but they don't want to talk about it. So there's a lot of stigma around that, fear of repercussions. So again, the personal questions that you'll discuss with your peers online, if this is the population you choose, is your thoughts, feelings, and reactions to the combination of prescription drugs and alcohol use and how that might go unnoticed. And then lastly, what are your thoughts about accessing and assertively reaching out to this population? Are we doing a good job of that already? Have we made improvements, and where can we make improvements? I hope this online this week has been helpful for you guys. Please continue to complete the activities that are listed on your DC Connect.